Tarek K is from Birmingham, Alabama. His home group is the Over the Bridge group, and he will be speaking on surrender and the conditions that sustain the awakened spirit for 45 minutes, followed by a 15-minute Q&A. Tarek, thank you for saying yes to God and Alcoholics Anonymous. It is an honor and a blessing to have you here with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Veronica, and thank you to Tamara for asking me to do this. I'm a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. My name's Tarek. I'm excited to be with all of you this afternoon for me. Just from the start of my communication with Tamara on this meeting, the name of the meeting, addition by subtraction. We've heard so many people, at least I have heard so many people over the years talk about, if we were to boil down our program, Dr. Bob said love and service. I've heard Sandy Beach talk about letting go. I think addition by subtraction is another way to sum up what it is we're trying to do on the spiritual path. The removal of things, so much of the recovery process. And I know I have some new friends on the call. This topic is going to be hard for some to hold a space where they can receive the entire message, because when we're close to our last drink, it seems like that's all that we can think about is how do I keep myself from taking the next drink? And so this idea for me of recovery being a journey home and the removal of so many old ideas. I just celebrated. So a power greater than myself separated me from alcohol and a host of other substances on the morning of November 5th in 2007. And for that separation date, I will be eternally grateful, and I will have a debt to repay God, and I'm the only one that can repay that debt. So my life has to be about testimony, about being a witness to the power of God in my life, as it is the source of the separation. It's the source of the willingness. It's the source of the desperation. It's the source of the love, the joy, the darkness, the horrible circumstances, all of it. It's sourced in this power that greater than ourselves. And so this idea of returning home has always fascinated. Has over the last several years has become something that I strive for. Recently I've grown very fond of when the words "I'm wrong" come out of my mouth. And for years I would rather say "you're right," but I had a hard time saying "I'm wrong." And for me today, that embodies a lot of what we're doing here in terms of our relationship to the present moment. And so I want to thank Tamara for asking me to do this. The Rumi passage at the very beginning, the heart, the great reality deep down within, was just beautiful. Chop wood, carry water. Every time I see that, it reminds me of my late grand sponsor. It was something he was the first person I ever heard say it. I don't think he was the first to say it, but he was the first one I heard say it. And so these are all wonderful, wonderful things that were there. And then the opening with the 12 steps, the little excerpt from the 12 and 12. These are all things that I hold close and dear to my heart today. This topic that we have, surrender and the conditions that sustain the awakened spirit. So if we think about pages 84 to 88 in our big book. And so today, I typically don't do this, but this talk is going to require that I share some stuff out of the book as I see it in my interpretation. How does it apply? Because we have to remember the book was written, Bill Wilson was treating the alcoholic as he was writing this book. And in that process, a lot of what's in the book's addressed to somebody newly sober or trying to get sober. So at the time, Bill Wilson, this book was written between October 1937 and April 1939. And so when Bill first started writing the book in 1937, he hadn't even celebrated 3 years yet. And by the time it's published in April of 1939, he hasn't even picked, he's 4.5 years sober. And so now we have people that have been walking on this path for 50 years, 40 years, 60 years that have their own interpretation of what they have experienced after putting the guidelines into practical application. And so I'm going to interpret some, but I'm also going to weave in the storytelling. We are an oral society. We pass down experience through our storytelling. We become okay with the past. We're able to escape the shadows of the past and see the breaking dawn all around us as a result of hearing one another's stories. So it's imperative that I share some stories. But this is a topic that required some reflection. It's a workshop that I've been doing. So I'm trying to consolidate that into these 45 minutes. Don't know if that's going to be possible. But when we look at, pages 84 to 88 in the big book, there's 3 words there that are repeated. There's continue. Constant is the root word of constantly. And then we have the word condition. So I'd like to share some definitions before I tell a story. So one of the definitions I found for continue is to maintain a condition. But the Latin root of the word means to make all one, together, to connect, which I was floored when I saw that definition. Constant is not changing or varying conditions. Constant. Standing firm, the Latin root. And condition, which is part of the title of this talk, means to keep something in a certain state. It's also a stipulation. And the Latin is together. So, if we look at the end game of our 12 steps, the awakened spirit. That's the end game here. That's the message that these are the actions you take to awaken spiritually. And then we try to carry that relationship with ourselves and God, the awakening, into all our other relationships. And so the first thing that has to happen is an opening. And let's think about the first great opening that we've all heard, a great story, the birth of Alcoholics Anonymous. For me, it's been easy to stay for these last 17 years because I fell in love with Alcoholics Anonymous. I fell in love with the fellowship. I fell in love with the program. It was infatuation at first, and now it's blossomed into, it's not a part of my life. It has given me my entry into manhood. It's given me my entry into fatherhood. Into being in a committed relationship, how to form a true partnership with another human being. All of these things I know today are based out of this way of life. So you'll never hear me describe my relationship with Alcoholics Anonymous as a portion of my life. And then I've got these other compartments. But the first opening for Alcoholics Anonymous that was mandatory, that gave birth, was the 1930s. I don't think Alcoholics Anonymous could have been built and come to fruition in any other period of time because it had certain conditions in that period of time. My current grant sponsor, he talks about this, and it really makes sense to me. We were in the Great Depression throughout the entire world. People's egos had been deflated. They had been stripped of most material possessions. At the same time, you have all of these spiritual movements, not only the Oxford groups, but then you have the unity movement. You have the science of the mind movement. You have the rebirth of Emerson. You have Emmett Fox. You have Joseph Campbell. You have all of these things are like an incubating dish for Alcoholics Anonymous. And when our forefathers were there getting this thing started, they didn't have no job to go to. They had no distractions in those early years. Granted, they may have had one Oxford group meeting a week, but they were getting together almost every night of the week. So that was a condition that gave birth to Alcoholics Anonymous. I am hard pressed to be convinced that it could have occurred in any other time. And so again, the condition was there. And so for us, there's a condition that has to occur, which is the surrender. But I'm here to report that I didn't surrender on November 5th in 2007. I was surrendered on November 5th, 2007. And it was a self-imposed crisis. It was a circumstantial crisis. It was events taking place, and I was separated from alcohol, and I was separated from some other substances. And the first miracle took place. The miracle of separation. Now, the miracle of the awakening spirit, the miracle of our return to sanity, these are incremental because they don't happen all at once. As we stay on this path, we begin to straighten out in other ways. Granted, once we become aware of the presence, maybe willing to believe in a power greater than ourselves, and we take these steps and we straighten out spiritually first, then the mental and the physical seem to straighten out. But there are layers and layers and layers to the mental, to the physical, to the emotional, to the spiritual. And so that first condition of surrender, why is it so important? Because it creates an opening. Just like the 1930s created an opening that allowed Alcoholics Anonymous to emerge from that opening, November 5th in 2007 created an opening for me. I was on a spree. I was not sleeping a lot. By this time, I've filed bankruptcy. I've lost my home. I'm living out of a hotel. I've torched most of the relationships in my life. And, I was separated through God dressing up. He dressed up. She dressed up. I'm not sure if God has a gender. I don't think the power does, but whatever it is, dressed up as a bunch of Duval County police officers, and they separated me, and they landed me in a 5-week incarceration. And Tamara's heard me tell this story. I'm going to tell a quick version of it because it's the surrender piece of it. I sat on the edge of a cot on the morning of November 5th in 2007. I was looking out this little slit in the wall that they call a window, and I had a realization that came to me. It was injected into my consciousness. I didn't think my way into the realization. The realization was, today is your new sobriety date, and it's Jason's birthday. Jason was one of my oldest and dearest friends, and he had died from a drug overdose on my birthday in 2003. I still keep a picture of him here in my little meditation area back here. I look at it almost every morning. Every morning I'm here, I look at it, but I travel for my job, so I can't say I look at his picture every single day. And so the message that was delivered to me on the edge of that bed was crazy to me, that I had that realization, and nothing in my thinking mind discounted the meaning. Now my new sobriety date, which is the sobriety date that I have today, had a significant meaning to it. And so the next 5 weeks in this jail were extremely difficult. It was a very dangerous place. About 5 or 6 days into it, I realized that there was a group of men that would go to the certain part of the pod. I was in a big pod by this time, 72 men, murderers, rapists, kidnappers, armed robbers, you name it, they're in this jail. And every time I left my cell, I had to have some type of verbal altercation with somebody to some level. But I saw when these guys walked to their part of the pod, nobody messed with them, and they had books in their hands. And so I decided I wanted to investigate what it was. Well, it turned out to be a Bible study. And so I went down there, I curled up in a ball, I sat up against the wall, and I listened to them talk. And they talked about things that the good people of Alcoholics Anonymous had talked about, that the good people of Alcoholics Anonymous had told me were important things: being grateful and surrender and restitution. All of these things, sacrifice, service, they were being thrown around by these group of men who I didn't know. So the message was, I need to go back to the 12 steps. It started to show up. I started thinking of a man who had tried to carry the message to me years before. I used to go to this man's house for a big book workshop. He's starting to show up in my mind. Where's that? How is that happening? I need to go back and find this guy. Somehow, I knew if I found this guy, my problem would be solved. Where does that come from? Why isn't my egoic mind trying to convince me of the next person to manipulate? Why is my mind not convincing me that there's something I can do to get myself out of this trouble? It's gone. Like a samurai in battle, I put my sword down and said, I'm done. But it was being done through me, through a set of circumstances and events. They took me to an arraignment. My parents had not wanted to talk to me when I first got there because they hadn't had much communication with me of late. And nobody wanted to help me. My brother, my best friend, and finally a guy that I used to be friends with, that I was in the illegal life with, he decided to get me a lawyer and pay for it. And this idea that I had leading up to November 5th in 2007, because of the guilt and the shame, was that nobody loves me. Nobody wants to do anything for me. Why would they? I've turned into a piece of crap. I fail everybody. And yet this man shows up and does something loving for me. So it smashes the belief system that nobody cares about you. They shackle me to my wrists and they shackle me to my ankles and they truck me into this courthouse and they say, you know, you sit over here where all the other convicted people are as we read your rights. And then this lawyer approaches, and I asked this lawyer when it's his turn to approach and talk to me, have you spoken to my mother? And he goes, yeah, man, she's right there in the courtroom. She's in the gallery. And so as I turned to face my mother, my vision was distorted. My line of sight was clear only to her. It was blurry everywhere else. Everything seemed to be going in slow motion. I observed a woman who was frail, weak. Her eyes were sunk in her head. Her cheekbones were showing, and her knees buckled in the courtroom. And the belief system that was crushed in that moment was, oh, why don't you guys leave me alone? I'm not hurting anybody but myself. Clearly, that's not a true statement. We destroy lives around us when we are in our cups. And that's what hit me that time. And so like Abby, I was raised from the scrap heap in that moment. Something in me died and something was born. The opening began to take place, and God comes for you in the opening. This power greater than ourselves comes to us in the opening. And so just like Alcoholics Anonymous had the perfect conditions for birth, God gave me the perfect conditions for rebirth. But there's an important condition prior. When we sincerely take such a position, all sorts of remarkable things will follow. I hadn't worked any steps at this point, but what I could, looking back in the rear view, because that's the only true way life is understood. We live life going forward. We understand it in the rear view, is that something sincere was happening within me. Something sincere was happening within me. And so as I mentioned earlier, that this entire point of the whole program is this awakening. And how do we sustain it? Well, the first thing that has to happen is the condition of surrender, which we can't bring about ourselves. That creates an opening, and it flattens out the ego. We cannot destroy the ego. We cannot defeat the ego. But we can put the ego in its right place through spiritual exercises and spiritual practices. The ego is, for most of us, here when we are brought here. Our goal is to put the ego in the background. And then it's going to be spiritual warfare from here on out, because the ego wants to come forth. And so when we get to page 84, it says, are these extravagant promises not for God? They're not. We think not. They're being fulfilled among us, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly. They will always materialize if we work for them. So there's the first stipulation or condition, the conditional statement. So I have seen in my 17 years so many people, and I don't mean this to sound derogatory in any way, and it's by no fault of their own. They come into our program and our fellowship, and they work the promises, and they wait for the steps to come true. I see it. I don't know about your part of the world and how the AA landscape is for you, but I know what it's been like for me. And that is a true statement in my experience. And so there's something that happens. It's funny, like I did a lot of therapy and counseling and treatment centers, like everybody, a lot of people, it's not mandatory. It's part of the drama. It doesn't have anything to do with whether or not you're alcoholic. You have two things to look at. When I honestly want to, I find I cannot stop entirely That's one aspect of it. And then the other aspect of it is like when I'm drinking, I have little control over the amount that I drink. Aspect number 2, mental, physical. Okay. I've got both of those going on for me. Well, then, my experience tells me that I was suffering from an illness, which only a spiritual experience would conquer. How do I know that? Because I tried every other option. I finally walked up on the stage and there was 2 doors and the game show host said, Tarek, you got 2 doors. You can die the alcoholic death or you can live life on a spiritual basis or foundation. And for years I was looking for door number 3, always looking for door number 3 because door number 1 and door number 2 looked equally distasteful. I didn't like the way I thought the experience was going to go if I walked through one of those doors. But that last time, after coming out of that jail eventually and being released, there's a part of that story because I was looking at prison time and I don't know if I'm going to circle back to it. My buddy Charlie used to say something that always made me laugh. Whenever I say that in a talk, it means that this moment right now is not the appropriate moment for me to introduce that piece of information. But the fact that I'm telling you I'm going to come back to it later probably means I ain't coming back to it. So I, like Charlie, get really excited when I circle back to something that I think I'm going to talk about later. But we're going to see what God does with that. And so the best way I can illustrate this is by telling you a story about the importance of this amends process, because these promises are talking about what happens to us after we begin the process of clearing away the wreckage of the past. And so in our 12 and 12, there's a wonderful little paragraph I'd like to read for you real quick. It's really short. It says, while the purpose of making restitution to others is paramount, it is equally necessary that we extricate from an examination of our personal relations every bit of information about ourselves and our fundamental difficulties that we can. Since defective relations with other human beings have nearly always been the immediate cause of our woes, including our alcoholism, no field of investigation could yield more satisfying and valuable rewards than this one. The restitution to those harmed has a reward in it because I get to understand the design features of this, my flaws and what has caused my failure. Because the miracle that's associated with 6 and 7 happened for me in the actions of steps 8 and 9. And so I was watching a movie about 8 or 9 months ago with my mom and my dad and my stepdad. And the movie was called Stillwater, and Matt Damon is in the movie. And in this movie, Matt Damon struggles with painkillers, and he ultimately loses a marriage and he loses his daughter over his relationship with the painkillers. And his daughter eventually graduates from high school, but she goes to Paris or France to attend a school abroad. And he works out on an oil rig, but he's on this path of redemption. Okay. Whether we like the language or not, the restitution process in our 9th step, the clearing of 4 and 5, the acknowledgement of where we're broken in 6 and 7, and a desire to restore the relationships we have broken in 8 and 9. That's a purification process. It's a repenting. The Greek root word to the word repent from the Aramaic is to change one's mind. To change one's mind. So this man goes on a redemption journey, and his daughter gets arrested, and she's convicted of murder in another country, and she's put in prison. And he blames himself for it. The way he lived his life contributed to her and some of the things, the situations she's put herself into. He can't shake the feeling. And so he goes over to Paris every chance he gets it to go see his daughter. And every time he goes to see his daughter in prison, there's a humble man who's there to take ownership. He set aside entirely what other people have done, and he's looking for his own mistakes and his own faults. And he sits there and does everything he can to be there for his daughter. And when his daughter shows up to the visitation, she's self-willed one riot. She's selfish. She's self-centered. She's a producer of confusion rather than harmony. If you watch the movie, you'll see this. And she's living on self-propulsion because she's convinced him that there was someone else there at the time the crime was committed. And so her father, because he's her father, decides to believe her. And then he ends up uncovering that there was a guy there. He ends up kidnapping the guy and holding him hostage this whole time. And he thinks he's doing something to redeem himself in his daughter's eyes. And then God puts another woman in his life that has a daughter, a young little girl that he gets to relive. He gets a second chance to be a father. And he's got his first daughter. And the hostage eventually tells him that his daughter hired him and was behind the whole thing. So now he has this conflict of not knowing what to do. Ultimately, he doesn't say anything, and his daughter is released from prison, and he has to take her back to the States. And I think they're from like a Midwest state. I can't remember if it was like Arkansas or Oklahoma, but they're at the end of the movie. They're sitting on the front porch of his home. And you see from the point of view of his eyes, and you see from the point of view of her eyes. And this man has done everything he can to clean up the wreckage of his past. And he sits there, and they're both sitting silently staring at the landscape around them. And she's full of pomp. She's full of ego. She's full of like this venom. And she turns to her father and she says, after all this time, I've come back here and everything looks entirely the same. And this is how the movie ends. He turns to her and says, I can't believe you're saying that. Everything looks entirely different. And that's what we have here in Alcoholics Anonymous. Through this process, the world begins to change because we change. And so the same things that we look at don't look the way we thought they were going to look. Chuck C. in his book, A New Pair of Glasses, that's what he's talking about. The new pair of glasses, though, is just it's not just the world that we look at. It's also what we see in ourselves. It's also what we see in ourselves. We're seeing ourselves with a new pair of glasses. And so for many years, I've always struggled. Is it 6 or 7 that ultimately are what everything's talking about? I just gave you a story about the value in 8 and 9 and how that changes us and transforms us. And then we talk about 10 and 11 being the true juice in our program. I'm a guy who firmly believes that 6 and 7 are tied to 10 and 11 because 10 is a step that we practice as we walk around. And I know when I'm conscious of the presence of God, somehow my defects of character are suspended in that moment. I have no problems in my life, regardless of circumstances, when I'm aware of the presence of God. And so therefore, in my opinion, step 10 has so much to do with 6 and 7, and 6 and 7 have the capacity to activate step 10. Wow. I know we have a new friend with us that's gotten, we're close to that last drink. But again, part of testifying is like, what is possible here? This is about so much more than just not drinking and just going to meetings. The 3 legacies, unity will create a ton of relief. Service work will create a ton of relief. In my experience, it's only the recovery legacy that creates freedom. So are we after relief or are we after freedom is a question I'd like to leave you with. And so it says this thought of making amends brings us to step 10, which suggests we continue to take personal inventory and we continue to set right any new mistakes as we go along. We vigorously, with energy, here's a condition, commence this way of living as we clean up the past. God, thank you for bringing me into the world of the spirit. My next expected duty is to grow in understanding the spiritual realm and being effective in this realm. I know this is not going to happen overnight, God, but help me continue this for my lifetime. There's one of those words I mentioned at the beginning. Help me, God, watch for selfishness, dishonesty, resentment, and fear. When these crop up, God, make me aware of your presence at once. Help me when I need to turn and discuss them with someone immediately, and to make amends quickly or admit that I am wrong when I've harmed someone. What's the purpose of all of this? To stay clean and remain open. The opening. To sustain the opening. Then at once, resolutely, I turn my thoughts to someone I like to say, God, help me turn my thoughts to you. Help me turn my thoughts to you. Help me practice this love and tolerance as a code. These are the conditions that allow us to stay clean and open. Some of them. I've ceased fighting anything or anyone, God, for by this time sanity will have returned. I will seldom be interested in changing reality. If tempted, I recoil from changing reality. I react sanely and normally, and I will find that this has happened automatically. So in the back of the book in the spiritual experience appendix, it says that most of us believe the essence of the spiritual experience is the awareness of a power greater than ourselves. I practice this idea of how often can I remember God throughout the course of the day, conscious presence. And what happens is if I'm practicing that, my need to change reality happens automatically. My need to not change reality happens automatically. I will see that my new attitude towards changing reality has been given to me without any thought or effort on my part. It just comes. That's the miracle of it. I'm not fighting reality, neither am I avoiding it. I feel as though I've been placed in a position of neutrality, safe and protected. I have not even sworn off. Instead, the problem has been removed. It does not exist for me. I'm neither cocky nor am I afraid. This is my experience. And this is how I react so long as I keep in fit spiritual condition. And so there's our condition again. And so the spiritual progress towards spiritual perfection is what's talked about in our 12 and 12. How do I go from page and how it works where it says, the principles we set down are not, we don't claim perfection is what it says in how it works. Spiritual progress rather than spiritual perfection. But yet in Bill's story, he says if we fail to perfect and enlarge our spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice, we won't survive the certain trials and low spots ahead. And then he throws that all out the window in the 12 and 12, and he talks about a perfect desire, a desire to go from spiritual progress towards spiritual perfection with the understanding I can't ever achieve the perfection. I'm always going to fall short. But when I aim for perfection, I fall somewhere pretty damn good. And so this idea of creating this opening and the position of neutrality, the best story I've got for this is what happens to me on a day-to-day basis with some of the incessant needs I have for the world to adjust to Tarek. Whereas I think on our spiritual path, the goal here is for us to adjust to the circumstances. And so there's a lot of what I've done over the past couple of years that reminds me of, it's like going to a movie and walking into the theater and there's no previews on in the movie. There's just a white canvas screen. And then the projector booth is at the top of the movie theater. Okay. So let's imagine for a second that the projector booth is the light of God, whatever God is. It's shining. And then what's on the canvas ultimately is life unfolding. And so you and I, we cultivate this watcher, this observer within us, the witness. That's how we try to walk around with a 10th step. At least the way I've been taught, we watch, we ask, we turn, we stop fighting. And so I'm sitting in the audience and I don't like what's on the projector booth. I don't like what reality is presenting to me right now. So what does Tarek do? What does Tarek do when my boys are not doing their chores? What does Tarek do when I'm the only one in the household that likes to make his bed in the morning? What does Tarek do when he thinks he's the only one that knows how to load a dishwasher properly? What does Tarek do when he thinks everyone should have a clean car? What does Tarek do when people in his corporate office don't respond to him in ways that are beneficial to his sales commission? What does Tarek do when the behavior of others exposes an assumption about the world that he doesn't want to admit may not be true? What does Tarek do when his home group wants to split their big, large meeting on Friday night into two groups? I don't like the idea of splitting a group. So what does Tarek do in all these activities but I listed the activities in a specific way: homes, occupations, and affairs. And so what happens is Tarek sits in that movie theater. Tarek sees what's displayed in existence in the reality. And then I pull out a duffel bag. I have a duffel bag full of my own projector slides. They're my old ideas about the world and the people in it. And I run up to the projector booth and I stick my own slides and I start to try to write my own reality over reality. What happens to Tarek at this point? He's living through self-propulsion. He can be a producer of confusion rather than harmony. He's really a self-seeker, even when he tells you he's trying to be kind and his motives are good. I am trying to pull my happiness out of life if I only can change reality. So this is what we have before us. The position of neutrality is the only place to access the presence of God, because God only exists in the present moment. The ego only exists in the past and the future. The ego is trying to kill the present moment at all times. The ego is trying to kill my soul and my spirit. This truly is spiritual warfare that we have engaged. And so it says it's easy to let up on this program of action and rest on my past achievements, for I'm headed for trouble if I do, for the ego is a subtle and crafty foe. I'm not cured from my ego. I cannot kill the ego. But what I have is a daily stay or a moment by moment stay of execution, contingent on the maintenance of God's presence from moment to moment. The practice and an ideal to grow towards, because this is a flipping back and forth. My experience is I can't sustain constant awareness of God's presence because of the existence of the ego. So every day is a day when there's a condition, must carry the vision of God's will into all my activities. How can I best serve thee, God? Thy will be done as it always is. This is a thought that I have to practice with myself constantly. I can exercise my willpower along this line, which is the proper use of the will. So for me, the proper use of the will is the remembrance of God. That's the only thing I'm trying to do with my will. Remembrance of God. Something magnificent happens in the remembrance of God. My defects are suspended temporarily. My ego is thinned out temporarily. And I show up different to the moment. And so then the ego comes back. So this becomes the practice here. And it happens through addition by subtraction. The addition is more time in the present moment. More time in the present moment. And so we get confronted with so many problems in life. And I'm here to report to you that every problem that you and I will ever have once we enter this spiritual path has one answer: more spiritual development. The goal is I remember God more and more every day as I walk through the day. And then I have these amazing experiences where the remembrance of God starts to happen on its own. There's no willful intent for the remembrance to take place. And now some people, they may think this is too much. This is about just not drinking. This is too complicated. And maybe it's just the way I've been designed. This is the stuff that excites me today. I still love sponsoring guys. I sponsor a bunch of guys. I still love working steps. I go to conventions. I participate at a very high level, but at the core of this is the awakened spirit. The awakened spirit. And so as I walk through this, and I realize that this ego wants to kill my soul and my spirit and wants to kill the present moment. And so I get into these places where indecision happens, and I'm constantly having to pray because I'm confused. I don't know what to do. And I think that has something to do with the will of God. How do I know if what I'm about to do is not self-will or God's will? And that doesn't matter to me anymore, because I want to share another story with you. About 10 years ago, I had a vision to start a business. It was a recovery center. My late grand sponsor at the time, his name was Mark H., and he had this recovery center, and I had access to how he had it set up. And so I started working on setting up a very similar place. And I got funding from a dear friend of mine, who had happened to be my sponsor for a year and a half before I met my new sponsor back then. I've had 3 sponsors in my 17 years, a guy for the first 2 years, a guy for 8 years, and then my current sponsor for the last 7 or so, a little over 7. And so I said the prayer, and one morning after I said the prayer, I found that my stepdaughter had drawn a little draw. She was 7 years old, and she left it on the coffee table. I still have it. It's right here. It says, "Follow your dreams." It's got a bunch of stars in a red box. And so after I said that prayer, how much clearer could it be? I'm supposed to follow this vision I have for this recovery center. And so I took the investment. I started the recovery center, and then 3 years later, it fails. I had not only failed as a business owner, I have failed my business partner. I have failed the man who carried the message to me and excited me about the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. I feel like I'm a complete failure. God, what did you do? I thought I was following your will. And so remember earlier, so this condition that we're talking about right now, the opening, the awakened spirit to see things from an entirely different angle than what the society and culture says we're supposed to do today. So you fast forward 8 years, 9 years. Last September, I'm sitting at a wedding. The father of the bride is my business partner. The bride got sober at our home group. The groom was one of the men that went to my recovery center and got sober. Not because of the recovery center, because we set up a structure that allowed him to get hooked up with someone in Alcoholics Anonymous, and he was able to have his own transformational experience. 2 of the groomsmen were also individuals that went through my program. And so I'm sitting there. All these years I thought it was a failure. All these years I thought I had failed to follow the proper guidance. And so when our book says the problem has been removed, and that this is our experience, so long as we keep in fit spiritual condition, there's something there about expecting guidance. And sometimes we think we're being guided, and something happens that contradicts the idea of being guided. And that's what happened to me for all those years, until I was sitting at that wedding and I realized that recovery center only existed so those people could be brought together, so the bride and the groom could meet. They just gave birth to their first child. I was at a conference 3 months ago, and my business owner, my former sponsor, the father of the bride was at the conference with me, and we were eating breakfast together one day. This man in that business venture lost over 6 figures in US dollars. And I told him the story I just told you. And he says, I'd pay that 1,000,000 times over for the man that my daughter is married to, and what has happened to my daughter's life, and then all of the people that have been impacted. I had nothing to do with that experience. And so I was at another workshop not long ago, and I made the comment of God plays chess while we play checkers. And someone in the Q&A portion of the workshop asked me, how do you know when God's playing chess and it's not us? And what I shared with them was that story. We will never know. But we practice these actions that I described to you in pages 84 and 85. I'm not going to even be able to get to 86 and 88. I thought I was going to be able to bring it in. But there's the conditions, the continuance, the constant desire to be brought back to the present moment has something to do with step 6 and 7. It's all centered on step 10. And so this awakened spirit, guys, has brought me to the best life and the easiest life I've ever known, but yet I get taken into the darkness I get taken out into the desert at times. It's happened to me many valleys in my 17 years. Why does God take me out into the desert? Because God's the only one in the desert. And all I'm left with is God. The ego has to be stripped in that way, I believe. And, I've had a wonderful time. I wish I had more time with all of you to talk about the rest of these conditions that we have in these pages and how they help sustain the spirit and maintain the opening. But I know there's not a day that's going to go by where I don't have my spiritual bread. I don't need to try to increase it. It's going to be there for me. And I have that debt to repay God that I mentioned at the beginning. And I'm the only one that can repay that debt. And I know there's one looking for me, and that one is death, and death is going to find me. And so my life has become about what am I doing with my dash? My tombstone will say October 12th, 1976 dash, November 5th, 2007 dash. I'm in my second dash. I have been reborn. What am I going to do with this rebirth? The greatest gift that God has ever given me is my recovery. And perhaps what I do with my recovery is my gift back to God. And I hope God is as pleased with my gift to him as I am with his gift to me. I'm a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. My name's Tarek.
And good evening. Hello, everybody. I'm Rasa, alcoholic. Thank you, Veronica. And thank you, Tarek. That was absolutely mesmerizing. I was busy taking notes and trying to take notes and not to miss what you were saying. Every word was like a gem. Fantastic. Thank you very much. So since I can't see any hands, I'll start with a question myself, if that's all right. When you spoke about your business venture, about your recovery center, you said that when the center failed, you were confused because you thought you were doing the God's will, and then if it failed, how could it be a God's will? And being a human, I of course have my plans and designs, and life goes on, and we have to make a living. And however, I don't want to embark on venture that is against the will of God, because ego takes over, of course. And I do my best how to listen to the will of God, but do I always hear it? So how do you distinguish between the will of God and your own ego whispers?
That's a wonderful question. And so just something to take forward whenever you listen to speakers, every speaker has their own conception of God that's in the background informing the message that you are hearing. And we have this beautiful part of Bill's story that has this choose your own conception. None of us would be sitting on this call today had that not been inserted. And so how I'm about to answer your question is informed by my own conception of God, which I have been investigating for many, many years and have eventually gotten to a place where I don't spend any more time talking about the will of God. I focus on God's sufficiency versus self-sufficiency. And God's will for me has nothing to do with the decisions I'm going to make. It has everything to do with my state of being. And so I believe there's only one will of God, which is to remember God, the remembrance of God. That's it. Now, and I say that I'm going to give you 17 years ago and 1 month ago, 17 years, 1 month ago, if someone looked at Tarek, they would have described him as self-centered, self-seeking, acting in self-will one riot, a producer of confusion rather than harmony. Tarek only does what makes him feel good. He doesn't care about anyone else and who he's hurting. Fair assessment, very fair assessment, right? You fast forward 17 years later in 1 month, that was God taking me to my surrender. So all those acts of will turned out to be the will of God. How many times have we sat in a meeting and heard someone in our fellowship say, I'm turning it over, I'm taking it back, I'm turning it over, I'm taking it back. And then they make a decision which appears to be an act of self-will, and they get collateral damage. Everything blows up in their face, right? 6 months later, we hear the same person in our group say, that was supposed to happen just like that. Because if that hadn't happened, this would not have happened, and then this would not have happened. And so it goes back to what I said earlier about God's playing chess and we're playing check. God's a great orchestrator. I do not know why I'm in the experiences I'm having. It's only life is understood in the rear view and is lived going forward. And so I don't spend a lot of time trying to examine whether what I'm doing is self-will or God's will. Some of the greatest acts of self-will, quote unquote, have created massive surrenders, massive letting go of old ideas, massive subtraction and addition. The addition is spiritual development. And so I think truly I've grown more in the areas where my self-will, quote unquote, has led to some significant experiences with surrender and darkness. Because as my friend Ali says, when I'm in the darkness, I think I'm being buried alive, but I'm actually being planted to grow. I think I'm being buried alive, but I'm being planted to grow. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. And on that topic that somebody said so nicely, we only see dark stars when it's a very dark night.
There you go.
Thank you. Wonderful. Veronica, please do come in with your question.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rasa. Thank you again, Tarek. You said something during your talk about sometimes you see, it sounded like a warning, you see people working the promises and waiting for the steps to come true. Can you clarify a little bit about what you meant by that statement? Thank you.
Sure. So a lot of people, because I used to own a recovery center, and I've done a lot of H&I work over the years. I spent a lot of time in the homeless shelters. I see people come in and they want to practice honesty. They want to practice perseverance. They want to practice courage. They want to practice, what are the 9 steps? Uselessness and self-pity will disappear. So they try to be useful. They try to do acts of service. We will gain interest. We will lose interest in selfish things and gain interest in our fellows. We try to be interested in our fellows. And we try to force the self-seeking to slip away. We try to combat the fear with our own ego. And, we want to change our whole attitude and outlook upon life. We practice the promises, but they don't work any steps. They don't. So the step work is so against the grain. Steps 4 through 9 specifically, they contradict the way you and I have lived our entire lives. And so why is it that we have so many visitors and very few people stay? I can't speak for your neck of the woods, but I know we've had millions and millions and millions of people that have not stayed versus the people that have stayed. I got sober 17 years ago. I had a litter class. Like all my litter mates, people I got sober with that stayed sober, only 2 people are left besides myself from that class of people that came in 17 years ago. I'm not saying they worked the promises and waited for the steps to come true, but I see it all the time where people are just working either the one word principles behind the steps, or they start to have some good things happen. Guys, if we just stay away from alcohol, good things will start to happen just by abstaining. And then we start to convince ourselves that the promises are coming true. If the language in the big book is true, and in my experience it has been true, what happened to me when I was halfway through my amends was one of the most fascinating experiences of my life. I learned so much about how inadequate I was in forming a true partnership with another human being. And so if you pay attention and you watch people, you'll see a lot of people that don't apply themselves with the steps, or they don't do a full disclosure in step 5. They don't make all their amends. They take and leave what they can. They sponsor when it's convenient. And what happens? Most of those cases don't end well in my experience. And so I have a guy right now in my sponsorship family who I believe is doing that. he talks about how great God is right now. He's being honest and there's no fear in his life, but he's balking at all the step work. I'm curious to see what's going to happen to him over the next few months. All we can do is try to corral him back, bring him back onto the reservation over and over, try to create the fellowship, the community that he's surrounded by a group of people that are doing this work and living this way of life. So it looks attractive to that person, not promoting it, but hey, watch us, spend time with us, see what we do. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my take on it right now.
Yes, thank you so much, Tarek.
Thank you, Tarek. I have a question in a chat. It says, you mentioned that every problem has one answer, more spiritual development. How do you know when you need to deepen your spiritual practice, and what does that look like for you in your daily life?
Oh, what a great question. So years ago, there's a man named Chuck Chamberlain who's passed away. Forgive me, I just shared his name, but he's passed away, so I don't know if that breaks any anonymity. But he wrote a book called New Pair of Glasses. And in that book, he says there's only one problem, conscious separation. And there's only one solution, which is conscious contact, conscious union with what? With ourselves, with God, with the people about us. And so this idea that every problem has one answer, I've never had a problem in my 17 years that I've looked back on and not been able to see my conscious separation, my identification with what was going on in my mind and the ego's presence in that. I need to create what's going on in here, and that's put me in a situation that has now been described as a problem. So I see conscious separation is at the core of every problem I have. I have yet been confronted with a problem in my 17 years that God's not at the center of the solution. It's always the answer to my problems, because this idea of when I'm aware of God's presence, there are no problems. I see it happen when I have my 13-year-old and he has just moved to a new school and he's refusing to take the actions to create some new relationships because he says everybody at his school sucks. And I'm sitting in the car with him and I can see that he's in a little bit of frustration and pain, but instead of coming down on him really hard about what he needs to do, I had compassion because I was able to pause and remember God and take a deep breath. When I'm able to practice what's on the end of page 88, thy will be done. It says, as we go through the day and pause when agitated or doubtful and ask God for the right thought or action, I constantly remind myself I'm no longer running the show by humbly saying to myself so many times throughout the course of the day, thy will be done. So for my spiritual practice, when I become aware of my breath, I become aware of God because God's the one breathing. And so in my acknowledgement of my breath and my ability to stay in that breath, I'm doing the whole 10 step in that moment because I've now become aware of God's presence. And I was able to not engage him right now because it wasn't the right time to have that conversation. But then 2 days later, he was in a very good mood. I was able to have the conversation. But my ego wanted to create a problem. I could save this kid a lot of heartache if he would just listen, because I want to force my experience on him. No, he's going to have his own experience. But it was only the presence of God in that moment that allowed me to live that moment in a different way. And so how do I practice this is, there are things I believe that are so important to the spiritual path. You have bonding as part of it. Talking about God with other people that are excited to talk about God is part of my life. It makes a difference. Guidance, having a teacher, a sponsor, a spiritual guide, that's important. Prayer, meditation, self-examination. We've got contemplation. I read a lot of books and I sit with them. I don't read them for information. I read them for the impact they have on my heart. And then I protect the spiritual work at all costs. And all of those things I just described, they allow me to experience the remembrance of God. I set devotion time. A lot of the guys I sponsor will go through periods where they say their prayer life is boring. It's gotten stale. I have learned 2 questions to ask myself every morning before I sit. And the 2 questions are, do I know or have knowledge of why I'm about to do these practices, prayer, meditation, read spiritual literature, and sit quietly? Why am I about to do it? And I just pay attention for about 30 to 45 seconds. What's going to come up in my consciousness? I don't care what comes up. My orientation to the practice has immediately changed when I ask myself that question. The second question is my heart present to what I'm about to do? Do I truly have a longing for God? Is that what this thing is about for me? Or is it about something else, which is also fine, but I have to investigate. So when I ask myself those 2 questions, it immediately changes my orientation to the practice I'm about to do. And it seems to be working. I've been doing it for many years, and part of me feels guilty in reporting this, but I don't experience staleness or boredom or an effect not being like, I'm not looking for an effect to produce. I don't pray and meditate so my day goes easier. I pray and meditate because I have to have God in my life and my awareness as often as possible. That's it. That's the only reason I pray and meditate. And that has happened because I've had someone who taught me that. And now it works for me. It's not the only way, but it's the way that works for me. I hope that answers the question.
It does. And it's just unbelievable, Tarek. I mean, I don't remember hearing what we heard tonight. So thank you very much for your share. Thank you very much for your wonderful answers. And this concludes Q&A session. Veronica, back over to you.